10 years ago, a beloved social worker vanished during a routine home visit. No trace, no answers, only a cryptic child's drawing left behind. Now, a retired detective buys a used couch from the same street. And hidden deep in the cushions, he finds a clue that changes everything. The small town of Ashbrook seemed picture-perfect, with its tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who knew each other by name. But beneath this peaceful facade, a decade-old mystery haunted its residents. Lena Harrow, a dedicated social worker, vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine home visit. Despite an extensive search and investigation, the case went cold. The town moved on, but whispers remained. 10 years later, Ronan Beckett, the now retired detective who had been assigned to her case, makes an unexpected purchase at a community estate sale. The used couch he buys to furnish his modest retirement home holds more than just worn cushions and faded upholstery. Hidden within its frame lies a clue that will reopen old wounds and unearth dangerous secrets long buried in Ashbrook. What happened to Lena Harrow? And who wanted her story silenced? Ashbrook wasn't the kind of town where people disappeared. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was the type of close-knit community where residents left their doors unlocked and children played freely until dusk called them home. The town prided itself on its low crime rates and community spirit, which is why when 28-year-old social worker Lena Harrow vanished one crisp autumn afternoon in 2013, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. Lena had moved to Ashbrook just 2 years prior, drawn by the opportunity to make a difference in a rural county with limited resources. Fresh out of graduate school with a master's in social work, she'd quickly earned a reputation for her unwavering dedication to the families under her care. Colleagues described her as methodical, keeping detailed notes on every case and often going above and beyond for the children she was assigned to protect. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, recalled Maria Sanchez, who had worked alongside Lena at the Department of Family Services. She'd bring in small gifts for the kids, nothing expensive, just things to let them know someone was thinking about them. Colored pencils, journals, little tokens of hope. On September 17, 2013, Lena was scheduled to conduct a follow-up visit with the Mercer family, who lived in a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The family had been on the department's radar due to concerns about possible neglect of their 3 children. Lena had noted some troubling observations during previous visits, but nothing conclusive enough for removal. She had told colleagues she planned to do a more thorough assessment that day. She never returned to the office. When Lena failed to check in by the end of the day, her supervisor reported her missing. Her car was found parked in the Mercer's driveway, her notebook and phone missing. Inside the house, the Mercers claimed Lena had completed her visit and left around 3 p.m., though none could provide a consistent account of what had transpired or which direction she had headed afterward. Detective Ronan Beckett, then a 35-year-old investigator with the County Sheriff's Department, was assigned to the case. Recently transferred from a larger jurisdiction, Beckett found himself handicapped from the start by departmental politics and severe resource limitations in the rural county. "We were operating on a shoestring budget," Beckett would later recall. "I requested additional manpower, forensic assistance, even bloodhounds from neighboring counties. Half of those requests were denied due to budget constraints, and the approvals came too late to be effective." Despite these limitations, Beckett threw himself into the investigation. The Mercer family, Gerald and Elaine, along with their 3 children, were interviewed multiple times. Their statements contained minor inconsistencies, but nothing concrete enough to justify arrests, especially with the department's higher-ups pressuring for quick resolution rather than thorough investigation. Search parties combed the woods surrounding the property. Divers checked the lake half a mile from the Mercer's home. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined the effort. But as days turned to weeks, hope diminished. No body was found. No evidence of what had happened to Lena Harrow ever surfaced. The case gradually cooled. Other emergencies demanded attention. The search parties dwindled until only Beckett remained, stubbornly revisiting the scene on weekends, retracing steps, searching for anything overlooked. But eventually, even he was forced to move on to other cases, though the file remained open on his desk. The Mercers stayed in Ashbrook for another 7 years. Gerald maintained his job at the local lumber mill. Elaine continued volunteering at church functions. Their children grew, though teachers noted they were unusually withdrawn. Then, in 2020, they abruptly moved away, citing a job opportunity in another state. Their departure barely caused a ripple in the community's consciousness, the connection to Lena's disappearance having faded with time. For Beckett, however, the case never truly closed. It followed him through promotions and eventually into early retirement at age 45, when a back injury sustained in the line of duty forced him to turn in his badge. The walls of his home office remained covered with maps, timelines, and photographs related to Lena's disappearance, a personal obsession he couldn't shake, even as the town's collective memory of the young social worker grew dimmer with each passing year. What clues did investigators miss a decade ago? And how did a seemingly ordinary piece of furniture become the key to unlocking this cold case? Retirement didn't suit Ronan Beckett. The sudden shift from 16-hour workdays to endless empty hours left him restless. He'd purchased a small cabin on the edge of town after turning in his badge, close enough to maintain the few friendships he'd formed over the years, but far enough away to avoid daily reminders of the station house he no longer belonged in. The cabin came partially furnished, but Beckett found himself in need of a few essentials. When he saw the advertisement for a community estate sale, part of Ashbrook's annual spring cleaning event, where multiple families contributed items, he decided to attend. "I wasn't looking for anything in particular," Beckett would later tell reporters. "Just browsing, trying to fill my days with something other than staring at old case files." The estate sale was bustling with activity, tables filled with everything from kitchen appliances to children's toys. In one corner, larger furniture items were displayed, including a worn leather couch with a "sold" tag that had just fallen off. Something about its sturdy frame caught Beckett's eye. "Only $50, said the volunteer, manning the furniture section. "The Prentices donated it. They bought it from the Mercers when they moved away a few years back. Apparently, they're upgrading their living room set." The name Mercer triggered an immediate response in Beckett. Before he could process the coincidence, he found himself handing over the cash and arranging delivery to his cabin. That evening, as he sat on his new purchase watching the evening news, Beckett noticed something odd. The cushion beneath him felt lumpy, uneven. Initially dismissing it as typical wear and tear for a second-hand piece, he eventually grew curious enough to investigate. Removing the cushions, he discovered nothing unusual. But when he ran his hand along the frame beneath, his fingers caught on what felt like a small irregularity in the wood. Years of investigative work had honed his attention to detail, and something about this didn't feel right. Using a screwdriver from his toolbox, Beckett carefully pried at the section of frame. To his surprise, it gave way, revealing a small, expertly crafted hidden compartment. Inside was a Ziploc freezer bag, sealed with duct tape around the edges, containing what appeared to be several folded pages torn from a notebook. With trembling hands, Beckett carefully opened the waterproof packaging. The pages inside were unmistakable, the standardized notepaper used by the Department of Family Services, with their logo watermarked at the top. The handwriting was neat, methodical. He recognized it immediately from the samples he'd studied a decade earlier. These were Lena Harrow's missing case notes. Dated September 17, 2013, the day she disappeared, The notes detailed observations from her final visit to the Mercer household. Her earlier entries were professional, documenting the condition of the home and her interactions with the children. But halfway through, the tone changed dramatically. 4:17 p.m. Something isn't right here. While interviewing the children separately, Ellie, 8, mentioned a secret room where bad people go. When I asked her to clarify, she became visibly frightened and refused to speak further. Gerald overheard and became agitated, insisting the interview was over. 4:43 p.m. Returning to my car to retrieve additional forms, I noticed what appeared to be a recently disturbed area of soil near the edge of the property, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet. When questioned, Gerald claimed they'd been planting a garden, though the location seems impractical and there were no gardening tools visible. 5:10 p.m. Elaine seems terrified. When Gerald left the room, she whispered, "He'll hear us and you need to leave now." When I pressed about what she meant, she denied saying anything. The children are showing signs consistent with psychological abuse. I'm contacting supervisor upon return to request immediate removal and police involvement. 5:32 p.m. Gerald insisting I stay for dinner. Atmosphere increasingly hostile. Something about the basement door, padlocked from outside. When asked why, Gerald became defensive. "I've made excuse to use bathroom, writing this quickly. We'll place in my bag and leave immediately. If anything happens..." The notes ended abruptly mid-sentence. Beckett sat motionless, the pages trembling in his hands. The implications were clear. Lena had sensed danger and hidden her notes, likely anticipating the possibility that she might not make it out of the house. She'd created evidence that could speak for her if she couldn't speak for herself. But why hide them in the couch? The answer seemed obvious. It must have been her only opportunity, perhaps during a moment alone in the living room. A desperate act by someone who feared for her life. The next morning, Beckett contacted Mitchell Reynolds, the current sheriff. Reynolds had been a junior deputy during the original investigation, one of the few who had taken Beckett's concerns seriously. "I remember how this case ate at you," Reynolds said, as they sat in Beckett's kitchen, examining the preserved notes. "The department was different then. Chief Williams was more concerned with the county budget than finding the truth. And the pressure from the mayor to resolve things quickly?" "Politics," Beckett muttered bitterly. "While a young woman's disappearance went unsolved," Reynolds nodded grimly. "We can reopen the investigation based on this. These notes are significant new evidence. But the Mercers moved to Arizona 3 years ago. Gerald died last year. Heart attack. Elaine and the kids, well, they're adults now, still live there." Beckett leaned forward. "What about the property? The farmhouse?" "New family living there now, the Holloways. Bought it in 2020 right after the Mercers left." "We need to search that property," Beckett said, tapping on Lena's notes about the disturbed soil. "Properly this time, with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Everything we should have done 10 years ago if we'd had the resources." Reynolds hesitated. "I'll need to get warrants, approval for the equipment. It won't be easy after all this time." "Then I'll do it myself if I have to," Beckett said, the old determination flooding back. "Lena tried to tell us what was happening. She left these notes knowing someone might find them someday. We owe it to her to finish what she started." What secrets would the old Mercer property reveal? And how many lives had been shattered by the silence that had protected the truth for a decade? The Holloway family was understandably shocked when Sheriff Reynolds and Beckett arrived at their door with a search warrant. The young couple had purchased the old Mercer property as their forever home, attracted by its spacious yard and the renovated farmhouse with its charming wraparound porch. "We had no idea," Melissa Holloway said, clutching her husband's arm as they watched the team of investigators set up equipment in their backyard. "When we bought the place, the real estate agent mentioned something about the previous owners moving for a job opportunity. Nothing about this." The area Lena had described in her notes was now covered by a wooden deck the Holloways had built the previous summer. The construction had required minimal excavation, just enough for the support posts, which explained why they hadn't discovered anything unusual. As the deck was carefully dismantled board by board, Beckett felt a familiar tension coiling in his stomach. He'd stood on this property a decade earlier, knowing something was wrong, but unable to prove it. Back then, Gerald Mercer had watched from the porch with cold eyes, answering questions with just enough cooperation to avoid suspicion. The department, eager to avoid the expense of a prolonged investigation without clear evidence of a crime, had eventually backed off. "Ground-penetrating radar is picking up something," announced the technician from the State Investigation Bureau, approximately 5 feet down. Definitely not natural. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care. By mid-afternoon, they had uncovered what appeared to be a plastic tarp wrapped around an object approximately 6 feet long. The county medical examiner supervised as it was carefully extracted from the earth and placed on a tarp nearby. The discovery confirmed their worst fears. Inside the plastic wrapping were the skeletal remains of an adult female, along with fragments of clothing that matched the description of what Lena had been wearing on the day she disappeared. A silver necklace with a small compass pendant, a graduation gift from her parents that she always wore, was still around the neck of the remains. "It's her," Beckett said quietly, stepping away to collect himself. The validation of his decade-long suspicions brought no satisfaction, only a profound sadness and renewed anger at how the system had failed her. The preliminary examination suggested blunt force trauma to the skull as the cause of death. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on the arm bones, indicating Lena had fought her attacker. While the forensic team continued processing the scene, Reynolds received a call from the officers who had been sent to search the Mercers' former basement. What they found added another disturbing layer to the case. The padlocked door Lena had mentioned in her notes led to a soundproofed room that the Holloways had assumed was a previous owner's attempt at a home recording studio. They had used it for storage, never suspecting its true purpose. Hidden beneath a section of newly installed carpeting, investigators discovered a trap door leading to a small crawl space. Inside were 3 sets of restraints bolted to the wall. "This wasn't just about silencing Lena," Reynolds said grimly as he showed Beckett the photographs. "The Mercers were hiding something much bigger. Those restraints, some are sized for children." The revelation sent the investigation in a new direction. Records from the Department of Family Services were subpoenaed, revealing that the Mercers had been foster parents to 11 children over a 7-year period before Lena's involvement with the family. The files showed multiple complaints had been filed by teachers and neighbors, but each investigation had mysteriously been dropped or deemed inconclusive. Most disturbing was the discovery that 2 of their former foster children had been reported missing after running away, one in 2009 and another in 2011. Both cases had received minimal attention, dismissed as troubled teens seeking new environments. Neither had ever been found. "The system failed these kids at every level," Beckett said during a strategy meeting at the sheriff's office. "Someone was protecting the Mercers, helping bury complaints, keeping investigations superficial." Reynolds nodded grimly. "And now we need to figure out who that someone was, and whether they were involved in Lena's murder." As news of the discovery spread, former colleagues of Lena came forward with new information. Maria Sanchez, now the director of the Department of Family Services, provided crucial context. Lena had concerns about how previous complaints against the Mercers had been handled, she explained, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. She was building a case, gathering evidence methodically because she suspected someone within the system was obstructing proper investigations. She didn't know who to trust. The investigation expanded to include a review of departmental records and communications. Patterns emerged suggesting that reports concerning the Mercers had been consistently downplayed or redirected by Walter Griffith, the former director of family services who had retired comfortably to Florida 5 years earlier. Bank records revealed significant unexplained deposits into Griffith's accounts, coinciding with the Mercers' tenure as foster parents, money that far exceeded his salary. The circumstantial evidence pointed to a horrifying possibility. The Mercers had been allowed to continue as foster parents despite red flags, because someone in authority was being paid to look the other way. For Beckett, each new discovery was both vindicating and devastating. He had sensed something wrong all those years ago, but had been constrained by departmental politics and limited resources. Now, standing in the sheriff's office surrounded by evidence boards mapping out the expanded investigation, he felt the weight of the lost years. "She tried to tell us," he said, looking at Lena's photograph pinned to the center of the board. "She documented everything, hid those notes knowing they might be her last communication, and for 10 years they sat hidden inside that couch while we all moved on with our lives." Reynolds placed a hand on his shoulder. "You never really moved on, though, did you? You kept her file active, kept asking questions when everyone else had stopped. That's why you're here now, why she's finally getting justice." As they prepared to extend the search to other areas of the property where additional victims might be buried, Beckett couldn't help but wonder what might have been different if he'd pushed harder 10 years ago, if he'd defied his superiors and followed his instincts. "We need to find Elaine Mercer," he said finally. "She's the only one left who knows the full truth, and I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. What horrors had taken place inside the Mercer home? And how had Elaine moved from apparent victim to possible accomplice in a decade-long conspiracy of silence?" Locating Elaine Mercer proved surprisingly straightforward. Since her husband's death, she had been living in a modest apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, working part-time as a church secretary. Her children, now adults in their 20s, lived nearby but, according to neighbors, rarely visited. Rather than risk alerting her with a phone call, Reynolds dispatched 2 detectives to bring her in for questioning. They found her apartment meticulously organized but sparsely furnished, almost impersonal. The only photographs displayed were of landscapes, not a single family picture anywhere. When informed of the discovery at her former home, Elaine showed no surprise. "I've been waiting for this day for 10 years, she said quietly. "Every time the phone rang, I thought it might be you." Brought back to Ashbrook, Elaine agreed to a formal interview without an attorney present. The woman who sat across from Beckett and Reynolds in the interview room bore little resemblance to the nervous, submissive wife Beckett remembered from a decade earlier. Her face was lined with the weight of secrets, but her eyes were clear, decisive. "I want to make a full statement," she began, her voice steadier than anyone had expected. "About Lena Harrow, about the foster children, about everything. But I need assurances that my children will be treated as victims, not accomplices. They were children themselves, forced to participate through fear and manipulation." What emerged over the next 6 hours was a story more complex and disturbing than even Beckett had imagined. Elaine described a household ruled by Gerald's unpredictable violence and psychological control. What had begun as verbal abuse early in their marriage had escalated after the birth of their second child, when Gerald lost his job at a manufacturing plant. "He changed after that," Elaine explained, "became obsessed with control, with creating this perfect family image while everything rotted underneath. When money got tight, he discovered foster care payments could supplement our income. The foster children, selected specifically for their troubled backgrounds and lack of strong family connections, became both sources of income and outlets for Gerald's increasing sadism." Elaine admitted to her complicity through silence, describing how fear for her biological children's safety kept her from reaching out for help. "The first time I tried to leave him, "He locked our son in that basement room for 3 days," she said, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. "Said he'd do worse if I ever spoke to anyone. I believed him because I'd seen what he was capable of." The turning point came with Lena Harrow's persistent involvement with the family. Unlike previous social workers who had conducted cursory visits easily managed with rehearsed responses and temporary improvements to the home environment, Lena had been methodical, observant. She noticed things others missed, Elaine said, asked the children questions when Gerald wasn't hovering nearby, started dropping by unannounced. The last visit, her voice faltered briefly. She found the hidden entrance to the basement room. Gerald had gone to get something from the shed, and she was examining the padlock when he came back in. The confrontation had escalated quickly. According to Elaine, Gerald struck Lena from behind with a fireplace poker when she attempted to use her phone. The attack had been witnessed by all 3 children, who were quickly locked in their rooms while Gerald forced Elaine to help him wrap the body and bury it near the property line. "He said we were all accomplices now," Elaine continued, "that no one would believe we weren't involved. He made the children help clean up the blood, told them this was what happened to people who tried to destroy families." In the aftermath, Gerald had become increasingly paranoid and controlling. He'd searched the house repeatedly for Lena's missing notebook and phone, convinced she must have documented her suspicions. The phone was eventually found in her purse and destroyed, but the notebook remained elusive. "He never thought to check the couch," Elaine said, a hint of bitter satisfaction in her voice. "She must have hidden it while I was getting her water, before Gerald returned. It was the only time she was alone in the living room." The years following Lena's murder had been a careful performance for the outside world. Gerald monitored every interaction, rehearsed responses to potential questions, and gradually closed the family off from the community. The 2 former foster children who had run away had actually been previous victims of Gerald's violence, buried elsewhere on the property after punishments went too far. "There's another site," Elaine said, drawing a crude map on a piece of paper, "behind the old tool shed near the creek. That's where the others are." As her statement continued, Elaine revealed that Walter Griffith's involvement went beyond merely accepting bribes to overlook complaints. He had actively steered certain children toward the Mercer home, specifically those least likely to be missed or believed if they reported abuse. "Gerald had something on Griffith too," she added. "Photos, I think, from some party years ago. They had an arrangement that went both ways." The decision to move 3 years earlier had been prompted by increasing pressure from their biological children, who had begun to challenge their father's authority as they entered adulthood. The oldest son had threatened to go to the police, leading to a violent confrontation that had finally convinced Elaine that escape was necessary. "We planned it together, me and the children," she explained, "waited until he was at work, packed only what we could carry and left. Found a women's shelter in Arizona that helped us start over. He found us eventually, of course. Gerald always did. But something had changed in him by then. He seemed tired. He moved nearby, watched us from a distance, but the violent outbursts were less frequent. Gerald's heart attack the previous year had finally freed them from his shadow, but not from the weight of their shared secrets. Elaine described the past year as living in limbo, expecting each day to be the one when the truth would finally emerge. "Why didn't you come forward after he died?" Reynolds asked. "You were free then." Elaine looked down at her hands. "Freedom isn't that simple when you've been caged for so long, and shame. Shame is a prison of its own making. My children are still putting their lives back together. I wanted to give them time before everything collapsed again." As the interview concluded, Elaine agreed to formally identify the locations where the missing foster children were buried and to testify against Walter Griffith regarding his role in the conspiracy. For Beckett, watching her being led to a cell to await formal charging as an accessory after the fact, the case had transformed from a simple question of what happened to Lena Harrow into something far more complex, a web of power, control, and systemic failure that had allowed vulnerable children to be placed repeatedly in danger. The couch was just the beginning, he told Reynolds, as they updated the investigation board with the new information. If Lena hadn't hidden those notes, if you hadn't bought that specific couch from that community sale, Reynolds nodded grimly. Sometimes justice depends on coincidences we can't plan for, but it also depends on people like you who never stop looking for the truth. As investigators prepared to search for more victims, how would the town of Ashbrook reckon with the darkness that had existed in plain sight for so many years? And what would justice look like for Lena Harrow and the children who had suffered in silence? The excavation behind the old tool shed confirmed Elaine's account. Forensic teams recovered the remains of 2 teenagers, identified through dental records as former foster children of the Mercers. Both had suffered extensive fractures consistent with prolonged physical abuse before their deaths. As news of the discoveries spread through Ashbrook, the community's reaction evolved from initial shock to collective soul-searching. How had so many warning signs been missed? Why had concerns raised by teachers and neighbors not been thoroughly investigated? The case forced uncomfortable conversations about the town's tendency to look away from troubling situations rather than confront them directly. Meanwhile, the investigation into Walter Griffith gained momentum. Federal authorities froze his accounts and placed him under surveillance at his Florida retirement community. Analysis of his financial records revealed a pattern of irregular payments not just from Gerald Mercer, but from 2 other foster families in neighboring counties, raising the horrifying possibility that the conspiracy extended beyond a single household. Beckett, though officially involved only as a witness and the discoverer of the initial evidence, remained deeply engaged with the case. Reynolds had granted him limited access to the investigation, recognizing both his personal investment and his investigative experience. Griffith's going to be a problem, Reynolds admitted during one of their evening strategy sessions. His attorney is already positioning him as an overworked bureaucrat who missed signs but committed no intentional wrongdoing. Without Gerald Mercer to testify about their arrangement, it's largely circumstantial. Beckett nodded grimly. We need more than Elaine's second-hand account. Gerald mentioned photos, blackmail material. If those exist somewhere. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carol Whitman, Griffith's former administrative assistant, contacted the sheriff's office after seeing news reports about the case. Now in her 70s and battling terminal cancer, she had information she could no longer keep to herself. Walter kept a locked cabinet in his office, she explained when Beckett and Reynolds visited her home. Official files were stored elsewhere. This was personal. Sometimes, when he'd had too much to drink at office functions, he'd mention his insurance policies against people who might cause trouble. More significantly, Carol revealed that before Griffith's retirement, she had witnessed him removing files and storing them in a safety deposit box at Ashbrook Community Bank. Armed with this information and a judge's warrant, investigators discovered the cache of materials Griffith had preserved, including photographs and recordings that implicated not just himself, but 3 other local officials in a network of corruption and exploitation spanning more than a decade. The evidence painted a damning picture. Children from troubled backgrounds had been systematically placed with certain foster families where oversight was intentionally minimal. Complaints were buried, reports falsified. In exchange, Griffith and his accomplices received payments and other benefits, including discounted building materials from Gerald's employer for their personal properties. Most disturbing were the journal entries and ledgers in Griffith's own handwriting, detailing which children were placed where and how much each placement was worth to the conspiracy. The entries were cold, calculating, treating vulnerable children as commodities to be moved around for profit. When federal agents arrested Griffith at his Florida home, they found him attempting to shred additional documents. Even as he was led away in handcuffs, the former director maintained his innocence, claiming he was being scapegoated for departmental failures that went beyond any single individual. Back in Ashbrook, the arrest triggered a cascade of new revelations. 2 former colleagues of Griffith came forward voluntarily, offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Current employees at Family Services began reviewing old case files, identifying dozens of children whose placements and subsequent complaints followed patterns similar to those of the Mercer foster children. For the adult children of Gerald and Elaine Mercer, the unfolding investigation brought complicated emotions. All 3 had been in therapy since escaping their father's control, working to process their experiences as both witnesses and victims of his abuse. Now, they faced the additional trauma of seeing family secrets exposed to public scrutiny. The oldest son, James Mercer, agreed to a single interview with investigators, providing crucial context about the household dynamics and confirming key elements of his mother's testimony. His younger siblings declined to speak publicly, but provided written statements through their therapist. "We grew up believing this was normal," James explained, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. "Dad convinced us that all families had secrets, that outsiders wouldn't understand our special way of doing things. It wasn't until I was in high school, spending time at friends' houses, that I realized how wrong everything was." He described the psychological manipulation that had kept the family trapped in cycles of abuse and secrecy, the intermittent kindness that followed episodes of cruelty, the enforced family rituals that created a false sense of unity, the constant threat that any disloyalty would result in one of the siblings being punished. "The foster kids got the worst of it," he admitted, his composure finally cracking. "We were told they were temporary, that they didn't matter as much. He made us participate sometimes, reporting if they broke rules, helping to lock them in for punishments. I've spent years in therapy trying to understand why I didn't do more to stop it." As James's testimony concluded, he made a single request: to visit Lena Harrow's grave once the medical examiner released her remains for burial. "She was trying to save us," he said simply. "Even though she didn't know exactly what was happening, she sensed something was wrong and kept pushing. I want to thank her for being the only adult who didn't look away." For Beckett, each new revelation brought a complex mixture of vindication and regret. The investigation was finally uncovering the truth he had sensed but couldn't prove a decade earlier. Yet the extent of the suffering that had continued during those years weighed heavily on him. "We're going to need to review every foster placement connected to Griffith," he told Reynolds, as they added another row of photographs to the investigation board. There could be more victims, more families affected. Reynolds nodded grimly. "This goes beyond just criminal charges now. It's about rebuilding systems that failed at every level, making sure nothing like this happens again." Neither man voiced the question that hung between them. How many other communities had similar secrets buried just beneath their peaceful surfaces? As the case expanded beyond Ashbrook to neighboring counties, what other dark conspiracies might be uncovered? And could a community built on silence ever truly heal? The courthouse in Ashbrook had never seen a day like this. Extra security patrolled the perimeter as Walter Griffith was brought in for his arraignment on multiple charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, embezzlement of federal funds, and being an accessory to 3 deaths, Lena Harrow and the 2 foster children found buried on the Mercer property. Media from across the state had descended on the small town, transforming its quiet streets into a buzzing hub of satellite trucks and reporters. Many local residents avoided downtown entirely, uncomfortable with their community becoming synonymous with such darkness. Inside the crowded courtroom, Beckett sat in the back row observing. Though not officially part of the prosecution team, his discovery had set everything in motion, and the district attorney had invited him to attend all proceedings. Beside him sat Maria Sanchez, who had brought a framed photograph of Lena to place on the gallery rail, a silent reminder of why they were all there. When Griffith entered in his orange jumpsuit, handcuffed and shuffling between two deputies, he appeared diminished from the powerful figure who had once commanded respect throughout the county. His eyes darted around the courtroom, landing briefly on Beckett, before quickly looking away. The proceedings were brief but momentous. Griffith's attorney entered not guilty pleas to all charges while requesting bail. The prosecution, armed with evidence of recent attempts to liquidate assets and contact potential witnesses, argued forcefully against release. The judge, noting the severity of the charges and flight risk, ordered Griffith held without bail until trial. As he was led away, Griffith finally locked eyes with Beckett. The momentary stare contained no remorse, only cold calculation, the look of a man already planning his next move. Outside the courthouse, Elaine Mercer's arraignment followed a different path. Having cooperated fully with investigators and provided crucial testimony against Griffith, she had negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact in Lena's death, she would receive a suspended sentence with strict probation conditions, including ongoing therapy and community service focused on domestic violence prevention. The decision had divided the community. Some felt she deserved harsher punishment for her years of silence. Others recognized the complex dynamics of coercive control that had shaped her choices. For Beckett, who had interviewed her multiple times since her initial confession, the truth lay somewhere in between. A woman who had made terrible choices while trapped in an impossible situation. As Elaine exited the courthouse, a small group of protesters held signs demanding justice for Lena and no leniency for enablers. She kept her head down, flanked by her attorney and oldest son, moving quickly toward a waiting car. From across the street, Beckett watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. The system was working, perpetrators were being held accountable, evidence was being properly collected and preserved, charges were being appropriately filed. Yet there was no true justice possible for Lena Harrow or the foster children who had died. No court proceeding could restore what had been taken from them. Later that evening, as the media trucks finally departed and Ashbrook returned to an uneasy quiet, Beckett received an unexpected visitor at his cabin. James Mercer stood on his porch, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking both younger and older than his 24 years. "I wanted to thank you," he said without preamble, "for finding those notes, for not giving up." Beckett invited him in, offering coffee, which James declined. "I've been thinking about coincidences," James continued, settling uneasily on the edge of a chair. "How many things had to align for the truth to come out? If Lena hadn't hidden those notes in exactly that spot, if my parents hadn't sold that specific couch when we moved, if the Prentices hadn't donated it to that community sale, if you hadn't been there that day, recognized our name." "I've thought about that too," Beckett admitted. "How easily it all could have remained buried." James nodded. "My therapist says it's not helpful to dwell on what-ifs, that I need to focus on healing now that the truth is out. But I keep thinking about all the moments when someone could have stopped it sooner. A teacher who noticed but didn't report. A neighbor who heard screaming but didn't call police. All the social workers before Lena who saw our rehearsed performances and didn't dig deeper." The young man's words hung in the room, a powerful indictment of a community that had prioritized comfort over confrontation, appearances over intervention. "Lena didn't look away," Beckett said finally. "She kept looking until she saw the truth. That's what cost her her life." James nodded, blinking back tears. "And that's why I need to be at her memorial service tomorrow, to thank her properly for being the one person who refused to pretend everything was fine." Would Ashbrook learn from its failures, or would the community return to comfortable silence once the media spotlight moved on? The memorial service for Lena Harrow was held on a bright spring morning, exactly 1 month after the discovery of her remains. Though 10 years had passed since her disappearance, more than 200 people gathered at Ashbrook Community Park, where a small garden had been dedicated in her memory. Her parents, who had traveled from Oregon, stood supported by Maria Sanchez and other former colleagues from Family Services. Behind them, arranged in solemn rows, were the families of children Lena had helped during her brief career, living testimonies to the difference she had made before her life was cut short. Beckett attended, standing slightly apart from the main gathering. He had visited her grave privately the day before, needing a moment alone to process the complicated emotions that came with closure. Today was about the community's acknowledgement of both loss and responsibility. Mayor Helen Chapman, who had been elected the previous year, addressed the assembled crowd with remarkable candor. Today we honor Lena Harrow not just as a victim of violence, but as a dedicated professional who saw what others chose to ignore. Her death represents not just one family's criminal acts, but a collective failure of our community to protect those who needed protection most. The mayor went on to outline concrete changes already implemented at the Department of Family Services, enhanced supervision requirements, new anonymous reporting systems for staff concerns, mandatory rotation of case managers to prevent inappropriate relationships with client families, and significantly increased funding for home visit safety protocols. These changes come too late for Lena, the mayor acknowledged, but they ensure her sacrifice was not in vain. As the formal service concluded, attendees were invited to place flowers in the memorial garden. James Mercer, attending with his siblings but apart from their mother, stepped forward to lay a small bouquet of forget-me-nots. The symbolic gesture, a young man honoring the woman who had tried to save him from his father's abuse, moved many to tears. In the weeks that followed, Ashbrook began the slow process of reckoning with its past. Community forums were held to discuss how warning signs had been missed and what responsibility neighbors had to one another. The local newspaper ran a series examining how preferences for privacy and non-interference had created environments where abuse could flourish undetected. The case against Walter Griffith and his co-conspirators continued to expand as investigators uncovered more connections between corrupt officials and problematic foster homes. 2 additional sets of remains were discovered on properties linked to families under Griffith's supervision, suggesting the network of exploitation was even more extensive than initially believed. For Beckett, the ongoing developments brought a measure of professional satisfaction but little personal peace. He had solved the mystery that had haunted him for a decade, yet the resolution had revealed depths of corruption and cruelty beyond what he had imagined. Each new discovery reinforced how preventable Lena's death had been, if only the system had functioned as intended. 6 months after finding Lena's hidden notes, Beckett made a decision. Using his retirement savings, he established a scholarship in Lena's name for students pursuing degrees in social work or child advocacy. The annual award would go to individuals committed to reforming systems that failed vulnerable children. At the small ceremony announcing the scholarship, Beckett spoke publicly about the case for the first and last time. Lena Harrow was 28 years old when she walked into a dangerous situation armed with nothing but a notebook and her commitment to protecting children, he told the gathered students and faculty at the State University. She recognized that something was wrong when others had looked away. She documented what she saw, knowing it might place her in danger. And in her final moments, she created evidence that eventually brought truth to light. He paused, collecting himself before continuing. The lesson of Lena's life isn't just about the dangers social workers face or the importance of proper protocols. It's about the courage required to see what others prefer to ignore. It's about refusing to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths need addressing. That's the legacy I hope this scholarship helps continue. As Beckett concluded his remarks, he noticed James Mercer standing at the back of the room, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. The young man had begun speaking at schools about recognizing signs of abuse, turning his traumatic experiences into education that might prevent similar situations. Not all questions had been answered. Gerald Mercer had taken some secrets to his grave. The full extent of the corruption network remained unclear, with investigations continuing in neighboring counties. And for the families of victims, no resolution could ever truly compensate for what had been lost. Yet in Ashbrook, something fundamental had shifted. A community that had once prided itself on privacy and non-interference was learning a different definition of neighborly responsibility, one that recognized silence could be as dangerous as violence when it protected those who caused harm. The used couch that had started it all now sat in the County Historical Museum, alongside Lena's preserved notes and a timeline of the case, a permanent reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to light. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to Last Seen Stories for more true crime narratives that explore not just the mysteries of disappearances, but the complex human factors behind them. How many other communities have secrets hiding in plain sight? What overlooked details might hold the key to cold cases in your area? Share your thoughts in the comments below.